Welcome back to another deep dive. We are so thrilled you could join us today because we're wading into some incredibly deep and frankly quite dark waters.
Yeah, very dark.
I mean, we constantly hear in the news, in political speeches, in history books about states fighting terrorism. It's a defining narrative of our modern era.
Mhm.
But today, we're turning that narrative completely upside down to ask a really core paradoxical question. What happens when the state itself is the terrorist?
It's a chilling reversal of how we normally think about security and government. And to really understand this, we've pulled together a fascinating stack of sources for you today. We're looking at dense socio-legal research, detailed historical accounts, and some profound political philosophy texts.
Right.
And the primary research we're leaning on uses what is called a comparative socio-legal methodology.
Which sounds like a bit of a mouthful, I know. But essentially, it just means the researchers didn't look at one country in a vacuum. They looked across multiple countries, totally different legal systems, to try and pin down a concept that, officially speaking at least, doesn't even exist in international criminal law.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are going to unpack the terrifying doctrinal challenge of whether a theoretical construct like the state can actually legally commit crimes.
Yeah.
We'll explore exactly how scholars attempt to define state terrorism, and we're going to dissect the highly disturbing justifications that states use to rationalize violent repression against their own citizens.
Now, before we go a single step further, we need to make something crystal clear to you, our listener. The sources we're discussing today contain highly politically charged historical content.
Very much so.
We're going to be covering both left-wing and right-wing regimes, historical revolutions, modern conflicts, and we want to explicitly state that we take absolutely no sides here.
None at all.
We are simply your impartial guides. We are reporting on the content provided in these texts, not endorsing any of the viewpoints, but purely conveying the concepts and historical arguments contained in the original source materials.
So, to even begin unpacking this, we really have to look backward. When we hear the word terrorism today, it evokes very specific imagery, right?
Usually of non-state actors,
Ugh.
Rebel groups or radical factions hiding out in the mountains somewhere.
Right, exactly. But the historical roots of the concept actually begin with the state itself. If we go back to the French Revolution, specifically between 1793 and 1794, we find the origin point.
The famous Reign of Terror.
Yes.
I mean, it's incredibly ironic when you think about it. The terror wasn't a rebellion against the government. It was a form of government by force. It was a completely state-driven action.
And it was entirely justified by what the Committee of Public Safety called the reason of state. The logic was that the survival of the newly formed republic justified absolutely any means necessary to protect it.
So the state openly embraced terror as an official administrative tool.
It did. What is fascinating is how that definition completely inverted over time. In the late 19th century, following the sudden rise of anarchist movements across Europe and elsewhere, the concept of terrorism started to separate from governmental actors.
It became almost exclusively associated with those non-state rebels, individuals throwing bombs at carriages or small groups attacking the establishment.
Precisely. And the framework shifted even further after World War II. The post-World War II era brought human rights into sharp international focus.
Right.
Early historical justifications, like those in the French Revolution, relied on protecting the nation from its internal enemies. But the post-WWII human rights consensus established a totally new baseline. Citizens must be protected from the state's tyranny.
But think about your own day-to-day life for a second. When you see police on the street, your baseline assumption, thanks to that post-WWII consensus, is that they are there to protect your rights. The state is supposed to be the guarantor of your safety, not the ultimate threat to it. Which leads us directly to the central doctrinal challenge of our sources. Can a theoretical construct, an entity like the state, legally commit a crime like terrorism?
This is where scholars violently disagree. We see a massive doctrinal divergence in the literature. Some scholars define terrorism strictly by the actor.
Meaning who is doing it?
Right. They argue that, by definition, only non-governmental groups can be terrorists. If a state commits horrific violence, they argue it might be a war crime, it might be a severe human rights abuse, but legally and conceptually, it isn't terrorism.
But other scholars reject that completely.
Totally reject it. They use an action-based definition. They argue that terrorism is defined by the tactics used, the act of sowing terror. Under that definition, anyone who uses terror tactics is a terrorist, and that absolutely includes the state.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the debate between these two camps is perfectly captured by two specific scholars in our sources, Walker LaCour and Ernesto Garzón Valdez. Let's start with LaCour's side of the argument.
Walter LaCour's argument rests on the fundamental nature of what a state actually is. He argues that because a state holds a legitimate monopoly on violence,
Meaning the state is the only entity legally allowed to use force, through the police or the military.
exactly, because they hold that monopoly, LaCour says the concept of state terrorism is fundamentally contradictory. In his view, a state cannot commit terrorism because it is already the sole legal arbiter of force.
To put that in simpler terms for you, think of it like a casino owner. The house literally makes all the rules of the game. The house has total control over the security cameras, the guards, and the dealers.
Right.
Because of that absolute control, it is conceptually impossible for the house to cheat in its own building. They write the laws, so they can't break them in a way that classifies as a rebellion against themselves.
That's a great analogy. But Ernesto Garzón Valdez looks at the historical evidence and counters that monopoly argument entirely. Garzón argues for the action-based definition.
Focusing on what the state is actually doing on the ground.
Yes. He focuses on the clandestine, unpredictable application of violence against innocent people to create generalized fear. Garzón argues that when a state breaks its own constitutional laws, when it stops using the courts and starts acting illegally in the shadows, LaCour's monopoly on violence argument is completely voided.
The state isn't acting as legitimate authority anymore. It's acting as a rogue agent against its own people.
Exactly.
So if we accept Garzón's premise that states can and do act as terrorists against their own citizens, how do they actually pull it off? How does the government transition from passing laws to disappearing people?
Our sources point to a scholar named William Schultz, whose research completely reframes how we think about state violence. He argues the state doesn't just wake up one day and start using unmarked vans.
It's a slow boil.
Yes, it starts with what he calls structural violence. Structural violence is fascinating because it rarely looks like physical violence at all. It is the underlying context.
The baked-in oppression of a society.
Exactly. It's where systemic economic and social disparities are deliberately maintained. People are deprived of basic needs, creating a baseline of intense inequality and desperation.
And that baseline of inequality acts as a launch pad for the next phase, which Schultz calls ordinary repression. This is where the state weaponizes the actual legal system.
The state uses legal, day-to-day mechanisms to maintain strict order. They aren't breaking the law here. They are using heavily militarized police, biased courts, and severe anti-protest laws to keep the population in check.
It's undeniably harsh, but it is strictly within the legal framework of that specific state.
But eventually, they cross the Rubicon to the final stage, direct violence. This is the point where the state actively infringes upon legal and ethical boundaries. They abandon the courts entirely.
This is where ordinary repression tips over into undeniable state terrorism.
Yes, and this progression perfectly mirrors what scholars call the dogmatic security worldview.
A mindset within certain governments where security is prioritized above absolutely everything else, regardless of the methods used to achieve it.
Exactly. And if you map this worldview onto Schultz's structural levels, you see exactly how it manifests. First, the state dogmatically ignores or dismisses the severe social disparities of structural violence.
Then, in the name of security, it drastically tightens the ordinary laws.
And finally, driven by this obsession with maintaining absolute control, the state inevitably rationalizes the illegal, brutal actions of direct violence.
Which brings us to a critical threshold. What actually qualifies an act as state terrorism rather than just heavy-handed policing? The scholars in our sources lay out 4 very specific requirements.
Let's go through them.
First, there must be a violent action or a highly credible threat of violence by the state. Second, it has to involve state agents, police, military, or government officials.
Third, the goal isn't just to harm the direct victims. It is to sow intense fear far beyond them, deep into the general population.
And fourth, the ultimate objective is to modify the population's behavior, to force total obedience through absolute terror.
Once those 4 requirements are met, we can look at the mechanics of how states execute this terror. 2 other scholars, Stoll and Lopez, created a highly detailed classification scheme for this. It often begins with diplomatic coercion.
Category 1.
Right. This is where the state uses the threat of terror as a mechanism of diplomatic coercion against potential victims, dissident groups, or even other nations. It's a menacing promise of violence hanging in the air.
Then there's Category 2, explicit, state-produced terror. meaning the violence is carried out directly by government agents, uniformed military or official secret police kicking down doors and doing the grim work themselves.
But the sources also describe scenarios where the state keeps its hands seemingly clean, Category 3.
State-sponsored and subrogated terrorism. I need you to clarify this for me because state-sponsored terrorism is when the state actively funds, directs, and trains third-party groups.
Like paramilitary death squads.
Yes.
The state is the puppet master, providing the weapons and the targets but avoiding direct attribution.
Okay, so state-sponsored makes the state a puppet master. But subrogated terrorism sounds terrifyingly passive. Did the sources give any historical examples of what that actually looks like on the ground?
Subrogated terrorism is when third-party groups commit acts of terror, and the state simply turns a blind eye. They offer silent acquiescence.
They refuse to condemn the act.
Right, effectively giving the perpetrators a green light and total impunity without directly handing them the weapons. A chilling specific example from our sources that illustrates these differences perfectly is Operation Condor in Latin America during the 1970s and 80s.
Operation Condor.
Yes, this was a massive, coordinated campaign of political repression and state terror involving right-wing dictatorships. It perfectly demonstrates both state-produced and state-sponsored or subrogated terror.
You had direct military action by state agents. State-produced terror where local police rounded up dissidents.
But you also had these governments coordinating with third-party intelligence across international borders. They shared tracking data on political opponents. If a dissident fled from one country to another, the host country would quietly allow foreign hit squads to operate within their borders.
That silent permission, that intelligence sharing to wipe out opponents wherever they hid, is the essence of subrogated terror. It is the ultimate contradiction, and it highlights a massive paradox in the texts. State terrorism almost always functions under the guise of counterterrorism.
The state claims it is fighting subversives or insurgents.
It claims to be protecting the democratic legal boundaries, but in order to do so, it actively and violently violates those exact same boundaries. They essentially destroy the village to save it.
And implementing a system like that requires a massive infrastructure, what the texts call the apparatus of terror. It relies heavily on two main pillars. The first is a highly effective state propaganda machine.
The state must legitimize its violent acts against its own citizens by constantly framing them as dangerous enemies, foreign agents, or existential threats to the nation.
Exactly. If the public propaganda successfully convinces the majority that the victims are monsters, the public will tolerate or even applaud the violence.
I have to pause here because reading this next part of the source material genuinely gave me chills. The second pillar is internal discipline, specifically something they call autocriticism.
It's a terrifying concept.
The idea that the state enforces a rule where you can't even question the morality of an order without becoming a victim yourself. It completely explains how ordinary people in the military end up committing atrocities.
The psychology of it is devastating. Within the ranks of the military and the police, the state enforces ruthless internal discipline mechanisms. They force total compliance and completely eliminate autocriticism.
No one inside the ranks is allowed to self-reflect.
No one is allowed to question the legality of the orders or to show hesitation. You obey the order to disappear a civilian, or you are labeled a subversive and disappeared yourself. It turns the entire security apparatus into an unthinking machine.
So how does the leadership at the very top sleep at night? Here's where it gets really interesting. What are the core structural arguments states use to rationalize this violence to themselves and the world?
Our sources detail a few main ones, starting with efficiency and identification. The state basically argues that standard democratic due process trials, gathering evidence, convincing juries, is just too inefficient when facing an existential threat.
Furthermore, they argue that identifying hidden enemies embedded in the population is too difficult. Because they can't easily find the specific threats, they argue they have to cast a wide net, which justifies diffuse, indiscriminate violence against entire communities.
The second major justification is grounded deeply in ethical philosophy. The state draws a hard, impenetrable line between public ethics and private ethics, heavily leaning into Machiavellian thinking.
Machiavelli famously argued that the morality of a state leader is fundamentally different from the morality of an everyday citizen.
Right. And in the context of state terrorism, this manifests as the absolute, unshakable belief that the end justifies the means. If the ultimate end is peace, security, and the survival of the state, then any means, including torture, censorship, and extrajudicial killings, are viewed as ethically justified from a public, state-level standpoint.
To give you a specific historical example of this ends justify the means argument separate from Operation Condor, we can look back again to the French Revolution. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, justified the mass executions of the guillotine, the brutal means, as an absolute necessity to secure the newly formed republic, the ultimate end.
Robespierre explicitly argued that terror was simply prompt, severe, inflexible justice. He believed they were using terror to give birth to civic virtue.
That exact Machiavellian logic didn't stay safely in the 18th century.
Not at all. If we connect this back to the Latin American dictatorships referenced in the text, we see these exact philosophical concepts codified into official policy through the doctrine of national security.
This doctrine explicitly framed certain segments of their own citizens, students, union leaders, journalists, as internal enemies of the state.
It essentially declared an invisible civil war. By framing it as a war for national survival, the government justified treating their own populace with the extreme brutality normally reserved for a foreign invading army.
So what does this all mean for us today? Torres Vasquez's research article outlines this massive, terrifying problem. We have rogue states slipping through massive legal loopholes because state terrorism is currently just a political buzzword.
It isn't a universally codified, prosecutable international crime on the books. That is the core of the problem. You cannot put a theoretical construct of state in a prison cell.
Because of this, Torres Vasquez proposes a vital shift for future legislation using a concept called lege ferenda. Lege ferenda essentially means the law as it should be, rather than the broken, loophole-ridden system we have right now.
He is arguing that creating a specific, undeniable legal framework for state terrorism is absolutely vital. We need modern mechanisms to hold the theoretical construct of the state itself politically and economically accountable on the world stage through crushing, targeted sanctions and total diplomatic isolation.
But simultaneously, we must use international courts to ruthlessly prosecute the physical human actors, the actual agents and leaders of the state, for crimes against humanity. It separates the state's liability from the individual's criminal guilt.
It's about finally closing the loophole that allows someone in a military uniform to claim they were just protecting the state, when in reality they were terrorizing it.
Well, what an incredible journey we've been on today. We've traced the dark evolution of state terror, from the guillotines of the French Revolution to the shadow wars of the Cold War. We've unpacked Schultz's terrifying progression of violence, showing how structural inequality acts as the breeding ground for ordinary repression and eventually direct terror.
And we've looked at the chilling justifications efficiency, Machiavellian ethics, and twisted counterterrorism strategies that turn the state from a protector into a predator.
Absolutely.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, consider how modern technology changes this entire equation. If a state can now use artificial intelligence, mass digital surveillance, and social credit systems to achieve that suffocating level of ordinary repression without ever fearing a single shot or making a physical arrest, does state terrorism even require physical violence anymore?
Wow.
Or are we entering a new era of digital state terror, where the chilling effect is so absolute that physical force becomes obsolete? If a state successfully uses the tools of terror to achieve total peace, but fundamentally destroys the rule of law to do so, what exactly is left to secure? Are we preserving a society or just a well-guarded prison?
A completely new and deeply unsettling question to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep questioning the world around you.